You're listening to a NOLIT Productions podcast, Michiganders, with Samuel Fitzpatrick. This is Samuel Fitzpatrick. Today's guest is Justin Wetenhall of Flint. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So go ahead and tell us about where you're from and what you do and what you like about Flint, and then we'll just take it from there.
Well, right now I live in the Grand Traverse District in downtown Flint, one of the first millionaires' rows, so to speak. My neighborhood's full of old lumber barons' mansions. I do a little bit of everything around downtown. Right now I work at the Flint Children's Museum on the weekends, but I'm also a board member of the Genesee County Historical Society, which we meet once a month at the Durant Dort Carriage Company office, the birthplace of General Motors, right downtown Flint.
Okay, so let's see. Now, are you a lifelong resident of Flint, or did you just move there? Oh,
no,
okay.
Actually, I was born and raised in Grand Blanc in the shadow of Flint. Went to University of Michigan Flint for 5 years, fell in love with the city, and last year made the decision to move from the suburbs into the city. A lot of people thought I was bonkers for doing it, but I'm in love with the city now. I'm very happy living there.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about your experiences in Flint, and more specifically, your neighborhood. Can you tell us about the Grand Traverse District? Is there...
Yeah, the Grand Traverse District, there's many different historical neighborhoods in Flint. Mine is significant because we have the Colonel Stockton Mansion. Now, Colonel Stockton was a Civil War colonel. And then later on in life, he became a philanthropist. He sold some land to the Michigan School for the Deaf. But what's really cool is after he passed away, his family sold his estate to the Sisters of St. Joseph's. And many people from the Flint area will know St. Joseph's was the hospital in Flint. And his house actually was the original site. They actually added on, the nuns did, they added on another wing to the mansion. And on the grounds, there's a beautiful spring there. That's why it's called the Stockton Center at Spring Grove. But many, would claim that the jewel in the crown of our little neighborhood. And then on my side, on the corner of 3rd and Oak, which I just think that's just a lovely street name to tell people, corner of 3rd and Oak, so old-fashioned. My landlord lives in a big Gilded Age mansion around the 1870s. A gentleman by the name of Hiram Smith built it. I believe he was a lumber baron as well. Don't quote me on that, but I believe he was in the lumber industry. My house, I've been doing some research. It was built in the mid-1870s. It was built by a grocery store chain owner, by a man named O.H. Pierce. And I found it out when I was doing some research. I found out that O.H. Pierce went to the church that I go to downtown, St. Paul's Episcopal. I found that out because I was doing the research on the house, and then I found his family's name on a Tiffany stained glass window in the back of the parish. So I found out that I'm actually, every Sunday, I walk the same way to church, the same way that the man who used to live in my house did before it was chopped up into apartments.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know now you and I both know that Flint gets a pretty negative rap in Michigan and in the country, and even because of the water crisis internationally. You live in Flint. I've visited Flint many times. I know it's not as bad as people make it out to be.
Right.
So rather than discussing all the negative things about Flint, what I want to do is I want to delve into the history of Flint. So why don't we wind the clocks back to turn of the century, 19th century Flint. Late 19th century and early 20th century Flint. What was going on? What were some names back then? What were the industries like? What was just in general? What was Flint like? What was going on at this time?
So I mentioned earlier my neighborhood was built by lumber barons. By the late 19th century, the lumber industry had kind of gone out the wayside. There was no more money to be made in that. However, there was another business that was forming. We had lots of leftover lumber. Also, there was a gentleman, Orrin Stone, that had a woolen industry. So you had the means to make something called carriages. Of course, we all know the old-fashioned carriages. Well, there was two gentlemen, William C. Durant, and there was J. Dallas Dort. Now, they were both from out east. Now, Billy Durant, William's name, or Billy, he was the grandson of Governor Crapo, another lumber baron, and he'd come back out west to Michigan to work in his grandpa's mills, then became a cigar salesman, and by the late 19th century, he had partnered up with this Dort fellow, and they formed a carriage company, the Durant-Dort Carriage Company. And then after Billy Durant took a ride with a man, Judge Wisner was a circuit court judge at the time. He was a tinkerer. Around this time, the horseless carriage was starting to come into the early American mindset. People were starting to tinker with these things. Judge Wisner bought a kit and took Billy Durant for a ride in this horseless carriage. I don't think it went more than 2 miles per hour. He only had to stop it by driving it into the wall of a building. There were no brakes. And matter of fact, Billy Durant was not interested. He thought it'd be a waste of his time. But he spoke to his partner Dort and some other board members, and they encouraged him to actually go into the horseless carriage business. So around the turn of the century, we go from carriages to the horseless carriages. And of course, we'll flash forward, but I won't go into details just yet. But of course, we do know that company later evolves into General Motors, basically the town that made Flint what it is today.
Okay. So early Flint, now I say early, I mean 1910s, 1920s. Flint today is about 80,000 people, and as we know, it was about 200,000 people in the 60s. Where are we in terms of population during this time? How large is it to the current? Let me rephrase that. What's the size comparison? What is the size comparison of Flint now versus then?
I can't give an exact number, but what I can tell you is Flint at the turn of the century would be a big small town. It'd be a very large small town. There's a general main street, but skyscrapers are starting to be built. Not like the ones you have in Manhattan, but there's buildings that are over 10 feet tall at this point in time, which is a big deal in the Midwest. At this time, Flint, Michigan is starting to be inhabited by immigrants from Europe. They're coming off the ships. They're going to New York City. And the train systems, of course, are taking them out west. They're looking for jobs. There's factories starting to be built in Michigan. Now, mind you, earlier in the 1800s, we already had lumber mills and there was other industry. So people were already in Flint, and there were already millionaires living in the city at this time. There was a whole new society there. We were starting to rival places like Detroit and Chicago. So people from around the world, when they're coming through, they might just stop in Flint and make their home there. So I would say easily by the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Flint is a big, small town. It's a lovely little place to live. You start to see beautiful postcards from this area. It's not a tourist area at all, but it's a nice industrial center, not unlike Detroit, for people to go and settle and work.
Okay, so Flint starts booming. Would you say we're now in the 30s or 40s, maybe?
By the 1920s, we're definitely booming.
Okay.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
Definitely booming by the 20s. There is of course society. Actually, I brought a magazine here called the Flint Saturday Night News and Views of the Week in Flint, dated October the 27th, 1928, almost a year to the date of the stock market crash. Just to describe for people that can't obviously see it, this issue is talking about a business association meeting, the Flint Community Fund Campaign held at the Durant Hotel, which the Durant Hotel is now a luxury apartment complex downtown. But in the 20s, it was built as a 5-star hotel. As a matter of fact, a lot of presidents stayed there through the 20th century. It was the place to stay. So we were such a city that we had a big thriving hotel where people from out of state would know about when they would come to visit the city.
Wow. So Flint, even though World War II had not even come yet, Flint had already built quite a name for itself, it sounds like.
Oh, yes, they had. Well, you said World War II, but we forget, coming up in a few days is Veterans Day, Armistice Day.
This is true. We should go back to World War I, because I know Flint did play a role in that conflict.
Oh, yes. Well, when I give tours of the Durant-Dort building, sometimes to the public, I make mention that, Billy Durant and J. Dallas Dorr had this great idea. They're going to make these horseless carriages. Of course, other companies are making them at the same time, but this is starting to become the bread and butter of Flint. Unfortunately, some people don't have such stellar ideas when it comes to the horseless carriage. Every time someone makes a technology that advances civilization, someone else has an idea to make it hurt civilization. Somebody else probably thought, especially maybe Uncle Sam, that they can attach guns and armor to these horseless carriages and send them to war. And when the world broke out in 1914, of course, our allies, we weren't involved in the war yet, but Great Britain, France, they were calling over to us here in the United States to send them arms. And of course, Flint started building early models of tanks and jeeps. Of course, we have to mention that Michigan in general was supplying a lot of the ammunition to the war front before the United States even entered the war, putting people to work. Then by 1917, we're involved in the war. So after World War I is over, yeah, Flint's a very prosperous town because we already have a big industry built around war production that literally the day after the war ends, they could start making civilian things all over again. Automobiles, luxury line cars, Cadillacs, limousines, things for the common man like Chevrolet, everything. It's being built right there in Flint in mid-Michigan.
Wow. Okay, so 1920s Flint. Now, as we know, the 1920s everywhere for this country was quite prosperous. Was that the same in Flint?
I would say it was exactly the same in Flint.
Okay.
This is the town that, of course, many people claim the middle class was born in. You have a lot of people that have made their fortunes, of course, in the automobile industry. There's still old moneyed people from the lumber industry that now their heirs are third or fourth generation. They're starting to squander the money, but they're still there. And with those people living here with good incomes, of course, you have places like I mentioned, the Duran Hotel. There's nice private clubs being opened. There's restaurants. Flint is a thriving community at this point in time. And, on the darker side, you have to note that, Prohibition started, and there are rumors that the Purple Gang had come through Flint. I've spoke with some senior citizens that were alive at the time.
Real fast, for those listeners that might not know, who was the Purple Gang?
It was the Jewish Mafia out of Detroit. They were their own gang. Of course, we all know about the Mafia in New York City and Al Capone in Chicago. This was Michigan's own claim to fame. And, of course, Michigan's right across from Canada, so all the illegal hooch, the bootlegged booze, is coming in through Detroit and filtering its way down. Of course, some of it might find a way down the Flint River. And I've spoken to some people that have claimed that they have seen the, unquote, blind pigs, otherwise known as speakeasies, all over downtown. To this day, there's lots of talk in the restaurants about hidden rooms underneath the buildings. There's tunnels, which makes me believe, the Purple Gang was definitely involved in Flint at one time. It's not confirmed, but there's lots of evidence to say that was happening.
This is rumored, or there's speculation?
It's more speculation.
Okay.
There's of course, I don't think there's any historians that worked with the Mafia writing down, their papers for people to find later on. But it's something cool to think about that, on the darker side, that maybe some crime did happen, but it was like the romanticized crime of the 1920s. But that being said, though, even though that was happening at the same time, on a lighter note, yes, Flint was very prosperous. You had the Flint Country Club, these beautiful banks being built. The architecture downtown is just incredible. It stands for what was going on at that time.
Okay, well, while we're on the topic of architecture and downtown, what types of architecture, if you were standing on Saginaw Street, which is the main vein running through the city of Flint, what types of architecture would you see?
Today or in the 19th century?
Let's do the time period that we're talking about, and then we'll also focus on today, like what's still around and how that's changed.
So if I'm walking down Saginaw Street, the year is roughly 1910. I'm seeing a few taller buildings. Like I said, they're mainly 10, 15 stories high. They all have that 19th century look to them, beautiful granite, marble, stone. The roofs are not yet turned green. They're still that bronzish color that, over time they'll corrode. Downtown, it's not many people know this, but there was actually this beautiful well, which I think I took you to show that one time.
I think you did, in the corner of Martin Luther King.
Yeah, there was this, it was a well.
What was that street address again?
Martin Luther King and Saginaw Street.
Okay.
Yeah. It's since moved, but back in around 1910, it was right there. And it was a place where people could, water their horses, but it was also very ornate. It's one of those forgotten landmarks, but it's still cool to talk about. And because there was a time when not many people were still buying the automobiles, a lot of horses. Also, downtown, there was a trolley system that ran on Saginaw Street. To this day, if you're walking by, some of the bricks have corroded, and you can see evidence of the old tracks along Saginaw Street from when there was electric cable cars that went up and down Saginaw Street in the turn of the century.
Wow. You mentioned bricks. I know one of the most unique things about downtown Flint is it's not a paved street, but it's just bricks. Hence, people call it the Bricks. Every year, there is a Back to the Bricks car event that occurs in downtown Flint. Can you tell us a little bit about the bricks that are there, why they're there, and why maybe that they haven't paved it over?
Yeah, so the original bricks, from what I know, were from the mid to late 19th century. It was just a cheaper means of building a road at that point. It was better than gravel, easier on probably the carriages. Now, in the 1950s, they did pave over the bricks. And then once hard times hit again in the 70s, they actually revamped and made the bricks again downtown. So I don't want to disappoint anyone, but I don't believe the bricks that you're seeing, most of them are not original. Some might be. But it was just a way in the 1970s to harken back to Flint's glory days when it was just, a burgeoning, growing city through the automobile industry. And they're still pretty cool to see. I've heard stories. I know we're talking about the 19th century, but, my grandma telling me when she was working downtown as a secretary in the 50s, breaking her high heels on the bricks. A lot of people fondly think of these bricks, and they harken back to I guess many people might claim a simpler, more peaceful time in our city.
Okay, interesting. So few downtowns, so few cities in this country still have bricks. And their street, they've either been ripped up and paved, and then it's one of the most unique things about Flint is downtown. It almost, in my experience, it causes you to drive slower.
It does. It's much safer.
And I love it because I drive. Well, yes, it's safer. I don't want to drive fast and damage my car, but then I get to drive slow and I get to see the beautiful architecture that you described. You see 19th century architecture, you see 20th. I see a lot of Art Deco too, specifically the Mott Foundation building.
Oh yeah.
Which is the 16-story building on Saginaw Street. It's Flint's tallest structure, correct?
It is now, yes.
It is now. The former Union Industrial Bank, as it was called. But anyway, I just love driving down Saginaw Street, and it's not quite bumpy, but it's like stop and smell the roses kind of thing. Just look around and and it's coming back in so many ways. Whenever I'm downtown, it's always bustling. There's people on the streets. Sometimes it's hard to find parking, which may be a good or a bad thing depending on how you look at it. There's newer businesses. There's younger people. There are a lot of U of M students, a lot of Kettering students walking around. There's new parks. A lot of history. There's statues that have recently been erected that are between. What streets are they?
That would be Kersley Street.
Kersley and Second.
And I want to say, yeah, right by the flat lot.
Yes.
Well, there's another thing, if I may mention, the arches.
Yes,
everyone knows the arches. I mean, whenever the news talks about Flint, they show the Flint Vehicle City arches. That's another landmark for Flint, if you think about it.
Let's talk about that. So why are the arches there? What do they represent? And also the title Vehicle City. What does that mean?
So Vehicle City, that's the term that actually came when we were still in the simple carriage business. It was said that basically because of Charles Stewart Mott's axle design and our blue ribbon wheels on the carriages, they were the most comfortable and probably most luxurious carriages on the market before we went to automobiles. And so a lot of people think the Vehicle City means because of automobiles. Actually, the Vehicle City harkens back to when we were making carriages. And at that point in time, even in the 1880s and 90s, people were calling Flint the Vehicle City. Now, the arches are rather interesting. They didn't come up till a little after the turn of the century. You'll notice they're electric if you're driving down. They always were. And that was just an interesting design for people to see when they're going through Flint. But those are not the originals. And there's an interesting story behind that. The originals were scrapped in World War I when we entered in 1917. They were scrapped for the war effort. And we didn't have them again until, I want to say, the mid-1920s or 30s. They were built back up. And then World War II happens. They're scrapped again. And for about 20 years, we just had regular old-fashioned street lamps like every other city in America. And then, like I said, in the 70s, when they were trying to revamp Flint City, the city of Flint's architecture, when they put the bricks down, the arches went back up. And it's just such a cool thing to drive through. When I'm just cruising through downtown, it's like I'm on the bricks, there's the arches, I'm looking at the architecture. You know, you were talking about how it's bustling now. A couple years ago, we were watching a clip of the Historical Society from the 50s, and it was advertising Smith Bridgman's department store, which that dates back to the 1870s. So that was around in the 20s, of course, the early 20th century. And it was this cute advertisement of the all-American family pulling up in their convertible, and mom and dad, Billy and Susie, all going through the different departments. But when the car pulls up, the camera pans through downtown onto Saginaw Street, and it shows all the well-dressed people, the shoppers bustling around, the heavy traffic. And for many years, you know, Flint downtown was devoid of life. But when I started going to college, I had this moment where I'm walking downtown, and I started seeing well-dressed people milling around, people in suits and dresses going about their work. And I gotta say, you know, in a small way, it kind of felt like I was living in those quote-unquote old glory days that people talk about. For me, it's an exciting time to live in Flint for that reason, that at times it feels like I'm living in the 1950s down there, especially in my neighborhood. I feel like I'm more living like in the 1870s at times, you know. All the old architecture sometimes in my mind's eye, you know, I look out the window and I could just pretend to see, you know, a horse-drawn carriage going down and, you know, a well-dressed young couple in a boater hat and parasol strolling down the boulevard. You know, there's something quite romantic about the city that I live in. Call me crazy, but I enjoy living there for that reason.
Well, that's a very good reason.
Yeah.
It sounds wonderful.
Yeah, I love it there.
So earlier you've mentioned the decade of the 1970s has come up a few times so far. Was this a pivotal decade for Flint? Was this kind of the beginning of the end, so to speak? Not to say that they've hit their end. Now, I want to say they are bouncing back, but maybe
This was a dip. The 70s were a dip. Okay. You know, if you think about it, you know, we talk about the 1800s when we were going through the lumber industry, and then that kind of fizzles out. People are wondering what's our next business. Carriages come along, and you know, the carriage industry kind of is looking like it's going to falter, and then they put engines on them. So, you know, if you think about it, every 2 decades up to that, you know, in the 1800s through, you know, around 1910, people were kind of leery, wondering what's going to happen next. Well, then from roughly 1905 to the 1960s, you have the great and powerful General Motors. Everyone's employed. You could drop out of high school with no education and work the line. It's great. The economy's booming. Of course, all good things don't last forever. You know, we had the 60s, which were a very tumultuous time. You know, I mean, the last prosperous time or glory days people could probably think of are the Camelot years during JFK. You know, 1962, President Kennedy actually came to Flint, to Atwood Stadium, our football stadium, to campaign there, almost a year to the day that the unfortunate events in Dallas. In 63. But before that, of course, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I know I'm rambling about the 60s in Flint, but, you know, I talked to a few people that, you know, they remember Flint was a big industrial center, and all through the 50s and 60s during the Cold War, it was rumored that the Soviets had nuclear missiles pointed right at Flint.
Which they may very well have. I have, in my research, or in my experience as a historian, I've looked at Cold War maps that were Russian or Soviet, and they seem to target places of high population and industry. So looking at the Midwest, Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Michigan City, Grand Rapids, Lansing, you know, its capital, its power. General Motors was there, but they also had targets over Detroit, Flint, which I can back that up. I have seen that. Also the Tri-Cities area, because Saginaw was another General Motors town, and Midland was and still is the world headquarters of Dow Chemical.
Yeah, so these are high targets.
Yes, and there's probably a lot of other places in Michigan that were military bases. I know up north we have some, but the Midwest, definitely industry being the Rust Belt. We had we certainly had Soviet missiles targeted at us.
Which, in a weird way, is a compliment. If the Soviets want you off the map, that means you're doing something right.
You must be important if the Russians got missiles pointed at you.
But at any rate, back to, I guess, the 70s, all up through the 60s, were that important. And then the mid-60s hit, Vietnam. Regrettably, in 1967, there were riots in downtown. There were race riots. And then the businesses started pulling out at that time. And then General Motors, just through their business practices, they made these beautiful cars to last. But as the economy takes a slump, if you got a car from 1960 that's going to last you 15 years, you're not going to buy a new car. You're not going to do that. If it's between a car and groceries, you're going to stick with that car. So all of a sudden in the 70s, new cars are just rusting on the lots. People start getting laid off. It gets bad. The businesses start closing. I've spoken with many people from that generation that they used to call Saginaw Street by the 70s Cardboard Alley. Businesses were shut up. I think the only buildings that were still in operation by that time were the Mott Foundation building and maybe a few other ones. U of M Flint was there, not that well known and popular yet. Then, of course, the 80s, we really took our slump, and then, a documentary came out about us, Roger and Me, which really gave
Michael
people
Moore's debut documentary, Roger and Me. It explores what was happening in Flint during the 80s, what was happening with Flint and General Motors, kind of the General Motors turning its back on the city of Flint and how that affected the people 30 years ago.
30 years ago.
Flint is still hurting from.
It is, but on a positive note, I actually watched that the other night, and I had a very emotional moment because the camera in the documentary was panning through neighborhoods that I now know and love, that I walk through at 3 a.m, and I feel perfectly safe. And it's so incredible to see, how much we've progressed in the past 30 years, which, if you think about it, the length of time, that's not too long of a time. In 30 years, we've gotten very well off. Downtown, some of the architecture, you asked me earlier, if I'm walking down the street, Saginaw Street in 1910, it's all glitzy and shiny, and there's marble and granite. Well, okay, if you're walking downtown in 2018, you're going to see those old buildings still. A lot of them are still standing. Some regrettably did not withstand the test of time, were torn down for new projects, but the granite and marble are still there for some of them. And then you have these new buildings, these new beautiful buildings being downtown. Now, I'm not a big fan of modern architecture, but I'm still appreciating the beauty that's being built downtown. Like we said, the statues of Billy Durant and J. Dell Stewart. There's a statue for Charles Stewart Mott, Louis Chevrolet, Albert Champion of the spark plug fortune. A lot of the old buildings, now the old businesses, have been turned to restaurants, like Blackstone's.
Okay.
Irish. It's an Irish American cuisine.
What? So Blackstone. This is on Saginaw Street, downtown Flint. It's a modern restaurant, but was it always a restaurant?
No.
It sounds like there's a history behind it.
Yeah, there is actually a history behind it. Now, the reason I like going to Blackstone's is because it actually used to be a men's clothing store, a men's department store. And a couple years ago, I figured this out because I was at Goodwill, and I found this hideous necktie from the 70s. I mean, it was horrible, and I just thought I had to buy it because I felt bad for it. And I looked at the tag on the back, and it said Blackstone's men's goods, Flint, Michigan. And I was like, oh my God, like they sold, and I confirmed it later. Yeah, that was a men's clothing store. But they still kept the name of Blackstone's from when it was clothing, and also the graphics of the name itself, the way the letters are.
It's the original logo.
The original logo. But I guess while we're on the topic of restaurants, my other favorite, I have to put a plug in for these guys. They've taken very good care of me. Batiste Temple Dining Room at the Masonic Temple downtown Flint. And we're talking about architecture. That's another beautiful building built in the turn of the century. It looks like an old bank building, but it was built as a Masonic temple. And you go inside, and downstairs is this restaurant from the 40s. Batiste, they've been around since 1947, and I always joke that you walk in, it's the same food, the same chinaware, the same cutlery, same decor, same clientele since 1947. And I started going down there as a college student, and they recognized that I was just a student looking for some home cooking. So they would give me discounts, or they'd give me an extra helping of, potato rolls or something like that. But I just had to put a plug in for my favorite restaurant downtown. They're open 11 to 2, Monday through Friday.
All right, open for lunch. And just lunch, right?
Just lunch. Okay. On Sundays, they have dinner.
Oh, okay. Let's see. So while we're talking about Flint, I know we've covered a lot. We've done a lot of brief about Flint's history, the turn of the century and 20th century, its rise and fall. Now, when most people think of Flint, and I hate to bring this up, they think of the negative things. They think of the crime. They think of the decrepit houses. They think of the water crisis, of course. I mean, people that only know of the town of Flint because of the water crisis. They have no perception of anything we just talked about. And they might be Genesee County, mid-Michigan people themselves. They could be on the coasts, or they could be in a different country. I've talked to people from around the world based on it. I have friends in Europe that have asked me about it. I was recently in Spain earlier this month, and I told them, I'm from Saginaw. I'm about 30 minutes north of Flint, and they go, "Oh, Flint, like the water?" And I would say, yes, they know what it is. But again, they have no idea the rich, vast, and important history Flint has. From what you described and from what I know personally, Flint really did put the country on wheels.
Yes.
They produce cars, but the actual production and labor itself, because of the efforts that General Motors have put in, what they created, the lifestyle they made, could you say that Flint really did build the middle class, the idea of a middle class?
I would argue that.
This expands beyond the auto industry, but other industries.
Yeah, I would definitely argue the middle class was born in Flint. Because as you know, in the 1930s, we had a sit-down strike, in 36, 37.
UAW.
The UAW. And before that time, of course, other industries had labor movements. There were union strikes. But this was the first of its kind where the workers, actually barricaded themselves in the factory. And what I do think is rather interesting on top of that is the lieutenant governor at the time actually called upon the National Guard. And in most cases, you'd think they're going to aim their guns at the strikers. The National Guard was called in to protect the strikers. So this was a revolutionary movement, if you think about it, where actually the armed forces were aiding the people that were rebelling. And of course, after that, they get more rights. The United Auto Workers gain more foothold. Like I said, more rights are granted to the workers. Paid holidays, health benefits, and of course by that time, and then after the 40s and the wartime, it becomes very prosperous. By the 50s, the dream is in Flint. Retire after working the line for 30 years. You get yourself a cottage up north, 2 Buicks in your garage, 2-story suburban house. Your spouse doesn't have to work. Your kids are going to be able to go off to college. And, of course, that dream sift through, and all of America all of a sudden becomes, in the 50s, this middle-class dream. Everyone can work the middle-class lifestyle, and they can retire at a reasonable age.
One income can support an entire family.
Yeah. One income per family. And, these people that worked hard in the early years say, I'm going to work hard so my kids can go to college and, prosper, or go work the line too. But yeah, I would definitely argue that the idea of the middle class American dream was born in Flint, Michigan. Of course, that's what I was also raised on, is that, when I was a little kid, I didn't understand all these ideas, right? But, it was always drilled into me about the unions and the UAW. And so even as a kid, and I'm sure that a lot of students to this day believe, little ones and even older, like, okay, UAW, Michigan, Flint, Detroit, that's where it all started, was the American dream of the middle-class worker.
Well, we've discussed a lot about Flint's history. Now, I want to switch over to Flint's historical institutions.
Okay.
I know there are several of them within within Flint and the surrounding Genesee County, but let's talk about the ones that are just in Flint.
Flint, okay.
What does Flint have to offer in terms of museums and other historic institutions?
All right. So one of the big things I got to mention, the holiday season's coming up. The Flint Institute of Music. That was actually founded by the Dort family, by J. Dallas Dort and his second wife. They were really into music. You know, at that time in history, if you had loads of money, you could just toss it to whatever charity or institution you liked, and they loved music. And so they formed the Flint Institute of Music. The building stands where his estate actually was before it burned. It's a great place to go. I've performed with them several times, the Flint Symphony Orchestra and the Flint Choir. They do the holiday pops. So there's right there, you got some culture already in Flint. You know, you have music. Of course, you have the library right across the street in the cultural center. But the other institutions, you're speaking of museums, we have the Sloan Museum. Mm-hmm. And I actually got to work there for roughly a year last year when the Titanic exhibit actually came to the Sloan Museum. I got to play some of the Titanic's passengers. It was really nifty. But the cool thing is, of course, besides that, you know, people go in and it's a nice museum where you can see a bit of everything from Flint's past. You know, you walk around and you see some old automobiles, other interesting tidbits of Flint's past. You know, they have quotes from citizens in years gone by. Other museums, we have, I mentioned the Durant Dort Carriage Company, which is basically frozen in time from around the 1890s when it was still a carriage industry. You have the Whaley House Museum, which I know you mentioned that the director will be coming in later on, so I won't go too much into that, but Mr. Whaley was president of Citizens Bank. He wrote the loan to Billy Durant to start the carriage company. That's the last house of its kind in Flint where you can actually tour a home that's frozen in time as an historic house from its era. There's also the Charles Stewart Mott's Applewood Estate that just opened up to the public a few years ago. You can tour. Now, for people that do not know, Charles Stewart Mott arguably was probably one of the richest men in Genesee County, if not Michigan. He invested in General Motors in the early days, died with billions to his name, left a majority of it to the city of Flint. You know, I would call him Flint's godfather. You know, we owe a lot to that man. He was very charitable, but his house is open to the public. There's also the Flint Children's Museum, which I mentioned earlier. I work there on weekends. It's a wonderful institution, more geared towards toddlers, up to maybe around 9 or 10 years old. It's a great institution to go where young minds, little minds can work and play. They learn through playing with toys, which I think is a really cute thing to see on a weekend or even a day in the weekday to see the little kids learning, which is right across the street from Kettering. That's the old General Motors Institute. Kettering is where the engineers go. Especially, it was founded by General Motors. That's where they started for the automotive engineers mainly. So that whole neighborhood over there is really fascinating. Speaking of institutions, mentioned the Whaleys. There's also the Whaley Children's Foundation. That's a charity set up for wayward children in the Flint and Genesee County region. That was started after the Whaley's son sadly passed away. And to honor his memory, the Whaleys, Mr. and Mrs. Whaley, at the turn of the century, founded this institution. There's a few other ones that are slipping my mind right now, but there's plenty of things to see. Oh, the Flint Institute of Arts.
I think you already mentioned that.
The music.
Okay.
Yep. Sorry. You're fine. The FIA. So there's the FIM and the FIA. They're all in the same neighborhood.
This is the Mott College and Cultural neighborhood,
yes, correct?
Yes.
That was really put together in the 50s. Once, there was a lot of rich people. People were coming to Flint to work, but they needed another reason to live here. And so a lot of the philanthropists built these museums and other institutions to keep people in Flint. If I may say, one great thing to do at the art museum, you go look at the Bray Gallery, which is, there's about 12 or so pieces. They're 14th century Florence tapestries, Venetian tapestries from the 14th century. The story is that a woman named Mrs. Bray, her husband was high up in General Motors. She went off to New York City to an art auction, saw these tapestries, dropped $6 million, said, I'll have the lot. brought them back to Flint, donated them to the museum, and put another $2 million up to build a special wing that replicated the room she saw them in Manhattan. So you go into that room, you could be in Venice, you could be in Manhattan, you could be in London or Paris, but no, you're in Flint, Michigan, which I think that was my place I would go during college, was to find peace, was the Bray Gallery. So there's lots of museums and other institutions to see while you're in Flint.
Sounds like there's a few handfuls of stuff to do.
Yeah.
This would take you several days to explore every nook and cranny through these various institutions. So there's plenty.
Lots
and
to offer.
The College and Cultural Center, I want to say, to Flint is actually very unique. That's something that you might usually find in a larger city, but Flint, for a city of its size, is lucky to have all that.
We are. Now, it's important to note that when these institutions were being built, that Flint was a miniature New York City in the 50s. It was a thriving, not to say it's not still, but we had the funds. We still do have some funding from charities and, public donations and whatnot. But yeah, like you said, we're very lucky to have these institutions, and the surrounding neighborhoods are gorgeous too. Speaking of architecture earlier, you drive through the Cultural Center or the Miller Mansions off Miller Road, and there's these beautiful Tudor-styled mansions built in the 20s and 30s that were built by these nouveau riche automobile barons, these rich people. The apartments, there's one apartment downtown, Sylvester Manor, which I'm told the story was originally built for the sons and daughters of these millionaires to go live in on their own, away from mommy and daddy. I actually took a tour of them, and one of them actually has a phone in the main room of one of these apartments.
Where are these located again?
The Sylvester Manor, they're located right off Saginaw Street. I believe it's we're on Court Street, I want to say.
Okay.
And it's this beautiful old apartment building, which, the story goes, there's phones hooked up in the apartments you could ring up for your chauffeur to come pick you up and take you shopping downtown. So that's just another thing to show, there was a lot of money. A lot of nouveau riche millionaires.
No shortage of money.
No shortage of money, no.
Which is probably hard for someone to believe today, to look at Flint and go, gosh, how could this place have ever been anything that you just said, but just a incredibly important and overlooked history, in my opinion.
Yeah, a lot of people don't see what I see.
So let's talk about modern Flint again. I know we're kind of bouncing around, but that's kind of how we're going to do this. So modern Flint, it's 2018. What are people going to see? What's going on now? And where do you, in your personal opinion, where do you think Flint is going to go in the next 5, 10, maybe even 50 years?
Well,
if you can answer that.
Yeah. So I'll answer your last question first, if I may. In about 5-10 years, we're easily going to become a college town. We'll become another Ann Arbor, which is beautiful. Ever since U of M Flint went in there, we, of course, have the Mott Community College. There's Kettering. There's Baker. College students are moving into Flint.
I've also seen MSU.
Michigan State University is there as well.
Now, not to cut you off, but is it Mott or MSU that's building a culinary school downtown?
That would be Mott.
Mott is, okay.
They're building a culinary school, which I'm excited because that's where you can get a decent 5-star meal, probably cheap as chips, because it's being made by students. So I'm sure it's going to be delicious, but if you're looking for a elegant meal, on a budget, that might be the place you want to go, and it's probably be a darn good meal as well. But that's where I see Flint going in the next 10-15 years, is another Ann Arbor, a cultural mecca, a college town. Now, you asked also what's going on right now in the city. If you're walking downtown right now in 2018, you're going to see some demolition of the old abandoned buildings, and that's a beautiful thing to see. You have some flat land, but that's okay because there's also community gardens happening that I've noticed here and there. New businesses popping up. There's a lot of construction downtown right now. You mentioned the culinary school, and it's going in an old building that for the longest time just laid vacant. And now there's scaffolding outside. Something's happening when there's construction outside of a building. Which I think is just phenomenal. Of course, I'll say this, it's kind of a bar town as well. Everywhere you go, there's, a nice little bougie place to grab a nice drink, or a meal. I would recommend Flint for a date spot, oddly enough. It's quite an interesting romantic town in its own weird way. If you're walking up and down the Saginaw, the Flint River there, there's the lights along the riverside. One time my freshman year of college, I was walking. It sounds crazy, but it kind of reminded me of the Seine in Paris. Just it was romantic. It's beautiful to me, at least, and if you just give it a chance, you can find the beauty in it as well. The old dam is gone. There was an old dam that was on the Flint River, built in the mid-19th century. It was a beautiful piece of architecture, but its time had come, unfortunately, and it was taken down. But now the Flint River is nice and open. There's new wildlife coming in. A lot of the neighborhoods that, 5 years ago might have been sketchy, people are moving into now. Like I said, my neighborhood, not even 10 years ago was, no man's land, but now it's full of medical students, and in my building, it's senior citizens. Everybody that lives in my building is, and the architecture is upkept. Downtown, like I said, there's all kinds of businesses popping up, new facades. It's a great place to go, work, and visit, if I could just
So it sounds like it's becoming quite the attraction.
Yeah, an attraction.
So we've talked about several neighborhoods. So we talked about the Grand Traverse District. We've talked about downtown Flint, the College and Cultural Center. Now, we've barely mentioned this earlier, but I want to jump back to Carriagetown.
Carriagetown. Yeah, I can't believe I didn't mention that. We were talking about the carriage industry. So Carriagetown is another historical district. That's actually where the Durant Dort building is located, the birthplace of General Motors. Now, what's cool about this neighborhood, so you have the Durant Dort Carriage Company office, and then right across the street, he called that Water Street, it's another set of bricks, it's another brick street, is what we call Factory 1, this big factory. And that Factory 1 is where the first carriages were built for that company.
Wow.
So that is a National Historic Landmark along with the office building, because that's where General Motors got its kickstart. And the surrounding neighborhood, you'll find homes from that time period, of course. Like one house right on the corner away from there, that actually is Whiting's old house. Now, Mr. Whiting was involved in the carriage industry. Many people in Flint will know the Whiting Auditorium. So, very wealthy man. His house, his original house, is in the neighborhood. Right across the street is a little pink house, the Charles Nash House. He worked as an upholsterer. And little known fact, I believe that company's gone now, but there was Nash Motor Works he founded later on. His house is in the neighborhood. A lot of them also are still, you could still live in these homes. Some of them are open to, buy and rent or live in. And I love taking strolls through that neighborhood because once again, in my romantic mind, you can stroll down that street and it's easily 1905 all over again. And you could just picture a carriage or a horseless carriage rumbling down the street and well-dressed young couples with parasols and boater hats walking down the boulevard. It's a beautiful place to visit. Carriagetown is very famous in Flint. A lot of people know about Carriagetown. It's where the industry started.
Okay. So besides those neighborhoods, are there any neighborhoods that I should have mentioned or that we didn't talk about?
There's one, I wouldn't call it a neighborhood, but there's Kersley Park, that neighborhood around Kersley Park. I mentioned, the philanthropy, J. Dallas Dort also realized that people needed a reason to stay in Flint, so he actually hired a man named Olmsted. Now, Mr. Olmsted was one of the designers of Central Park in New York City, so he contacted this man to come and design parks here in Flint. The J. Dallas Dort Park System, and Kersley Park, right off of Robert T. Boulevard, that is the jewel in the crown. And that was constructed around the late 19th century. A big, beautiful pavilion was built there in the 20s. Many, many years I've had the joy of performing live on stage in the pavilion with Shakespeare in our parks, musicals, all kinds of festivals happen in that park. The surrounding neighborhood, of course, is beautiful, too. You go down Kersley Park Boulevard, and there's just rows of just beautiful old townhouses dating back to the 20s. It was quite a happening place. So that's another interesting neighborhood. So we mentioned the Carriagetown, the Kersley Park neighborhood, Grand Traverse District, the Miller Mansions, the College Cultural. It's not a neighborhood, but if I may, Glenwood Cemetery. Can I chat a bit about Glenwood?
Absolutely.
If I'm not rambling on too much, Glenwood Cemetery. That's one of my favorite places to go. Oftentimes, when friends like yourself, Sam, come to Flint for the first time, and they ride with me, I take them to some place. I mentioned those neighborhoods, but I also take them.
Well, real fast for clarification, I've been to Flint many times, but it was never to any of these mentioned areas.
Right.
It was, I live in Saginaw, so being 30 minutes away from Flint, you either drove through it or you stopped somewhere in the burbs, but I had never been to the real Flint proper, if I may.
Yeah, I guess I should clarify that. Yeah. I apologize. That, when people really first come to experience Flint, friends of mine, I take them to these places, and as morbid as it sounds, I always say, hey, do you like a cemetery? And people are like, what? I say, no, Glenwood Cemetery. I always joke, people are just dying to get there because the who's who of the social registry at Flint are buried at Glenwood Cemetery. You visit these establishments downtown and you hear the history. Well, you can go visit them too. The cemetery goes back to around 1857, and it was a rural cemetery built as a park. People in those days, actually, the Victorian era, would actually go to cemeteries as parks. They'd have picnics there. Their kids would play there. Sometimes weddings happened at cemeteries, as weird as it sounds. And you could tell by the way the cemetery is laid out. And it's not just your generic tombstones. Mind you, multimillionaires are buried there. And it's almost as if the pharaohs are buried there. The way these monuments are built to these magnets of industry, if dead center of the cemetery is Mott's mausoleum, the richest man in the graveyard, and the trees actually in the fall time change to the colors of the Applewood estate, it said, to yellow and black, which is something really cool to see. I think I got a glimpse of it earlier this fall, actually. But also there, of course, Whiting is buried there. The entire Dort family is buried there. One interesting grave there is Flint's first citizen. Flint's first founder, Jacob Smith's family, is buried in a plot in Glenwood Cemetery. Now, it's kind of sketchy because we're not sure if he himself is buried there. There is a monument to Jacob Smith as the first European descendant that came through what is now Flint and Genesee County, but his family is all buried there as well. It's this old grave marker. The grave marker is at least from the 1820s. But what's interesting is one of his descendants, one of his daughters, married, going full circle, Colonel Stockton. So Colonel Stockton, who I mentioned before, of the Stockton Center at Spring Grove, Sisters of St. Joseph, lived in my neighborhood. He married one of Jacob Smith's daughters. Now, Jacob Smith died poor, but his daughters inherited all of the land that he purchased that became Genesee County, lumber-rich land. So, of course, the Stocktons became lumber barons as well. So that's really where the industry started with lumber. But I digress. That's some of the cool graves you can visit. In the fall time, sometimes they have a walk through the graveyard where they hire actors to stand at the graves, dressed up and portraying the people that are buried there, some of the bigger names. So that's one of my favorite places to take people if they want the full Flint experience. A little bit morbid, but it's a great experience to drive through that beautiful old cemetery. So not a neighborhood, but maybe if you're 6 feet below the ground, I guess it is a neighborhood for you.
Well, your final neighborhood.
Yes.
Well, let's see. I have one more topic I want to talk about. Now, we've already mentioned some of the restaurants that are good to go to. Are there any bars you would suggest people to check out? Because it seems like there's a lot of startups. There's a lot of coffee shops moving in. There's a lot of new bars. There's a lot of younger people moving in.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bars, a lot of coffee shops. Like I said, it's a college town, so of course there's going to be bars, which is godsend if you think about it in a weird way. So, okay, we'll start with being sober. If you want just coffee, you can go to Cafe Rima. Beautiful place in Saginaw Street. It's themed like it's the 1920s. I've even joked to some of the people that work there that it reminds me of a 1920s brothel. It's got like the red velvet curtains and the music play. It's not just like cliche jazz music. They actually have Al Bowley and Bing Crosby and people of that singing songs from the 20s playing over the speakers. The coffee's usually good. They have French and Italian sodas. And when I go in there, I'll just say, surprise me. Just give me a surprise flavor. And they usually do. They hold up pretty well. I say usually all the time. The sodas taste pretty good there. There's also a new startup on the other side of Saginaw Street, Foster Coffee.
Now they are out of Owasso, correct?
They're out of Owasso, but they have a branch here in Flint. And that's part of another startup business in downtown, the Ferris Building, which that's basically a business incubator. But still, I've gone in the coffee shop several times and got myself a nice coffee. So those are some of the nice coffee shops you can go to. And now for the bars, for people that want to have some nightlife or some day drinking. There's Churchill's, which is an old establishment, going back at least to the 1980s. My father remembers even drinking there at times. I've gone there pretty much all my college years. Blackstone's restaurant, but another bar. Then you also have the Market Tap at the Flint Farmers Market with a beautiful balcony that overlooks the city. Great view. And Jackie, the bartender there, is fabulous. Jackie, if you're listening, I love you, girl. There's also, there's all kinds of bars downtown. I have a private membership at the Flint Arrowhead Veterans Club. That's actually an old Veterans Hall from 1947. Right after World War II. In the 70s, it opened up to civilians to join. But I always go there for drinks. There's all kinds of drinking establishments, like I said, downtown. And some of them are probably drawing a blank right now. There's Cork on Saginaw, which is phenomenal. That's a wine bar, rather bougie. You feel like you're in, a fashionable part of Manhattan when you go in there and order yourself a glass of wine or a double bourbon. It's a great place to go.
I'm a huge wine drinker. I'd love to go there.
Oh, you should go there. We should go there sometime.
I know I've eaten there, but I haven't had any vino, any wine.
Oh, yeah. That's a nice place to go because they have a nice little outdoor area when it's nicer weather. And what I find so funny is because, I'm downtown all the time and I know a lot of people, and I'll go there to have a nice glass of wine and during a festival, and people walk by and I can't even enjoy my glass because so many people saying, "Hello, Justin." I'm like, "Hello." But I'm not complaining. I love everyone downtown. It's great. It's great to live in such an area where I could just go to a place and, literally every bar is kind of like Cheers for me. Everybody knows my name. You walk in and, some bars, they have my, my regular drink. Other ones, I always just say, surprise me. But, I guess I digress. I talk the coffee shops, the restaurants, the bars, there's so much to offer downtown. There's actually a bar crawl. I believe some very good friends of mine in December are hosting a thing called Santarchy, where you dress up as Christmas characters and you go on a bar crawl through downtown Flint. It was quite a success last year. I've been on several bar crawls. There's also Soggy Bottoms. That's a nice place for the younger crowd to go. So there's so much to offer, so much to drink, so much to eat.
How about the White Horse?
Oh, I forgot the White Horse. That's in my neighborhood. That is that's a staple of Flint. You go in there, you never know who you're going to see in there. I've walked into times and there's fundraisers for politicians. I've seen, Flint notables in there. The kitchen is open till at least midnight. It's one of the only bars that does that. So naturally, that's a place, because I was in show business, a lot of actors will go after rehearsals or after a play. And sometimes you go in the White Horse, it's right off of Court Street. You go into the White Horse and there's like 3 different casts from 3 different plays in there, just having a jolly old time. You go in there in the mornings and, you see like the night staff from the hospital going in there after work and they're having a drink. You're like, "Oh my God, it's 9 a.m, you lush." But no, it's because they've been working all night long at the hospital and they've gone there, to have their dinner, I guess you would call it at that time. But that's in my neighborhood. So there's been many nights where I'm too lazy to drive out or walk anywhere. So I'll just call ahead and say, "Hey, it's Justin. I want my usual steak dinner." And then it's like a 5-minute walk from my apartment. I go there, sit at the bar, maybe have a shot.
Very personable, it sounds like.
It is. It's one of those places where I walk in, they know what I want.
Sounds like a really great neighborhood. You have all that culture, food, bar, church, if you're into that, all within walking distance. You don't have to drive anywhere except for work. But
hey, I've found that I've lost a little bit of weight living downtown. You know,
Got its perks.
I walk everywhere. You know, it's great. And sometimes I'll be restless and I'll roam the streets at midnight just because I can. You know, it's fun.
Well, I think we'll end there on a positive note.
Yeah.
I say we covered quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Learned a lot about Flint's history, its various neighborhoods, its culture, what it's like, what's going on, and where it's headed. And that's it. That's straight from the horse's mouth. This was Justin Wetenhall, a true Flintstone. Justin, thanks for being on our show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Any last minute words? Anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, I'm just going to say something that a very dear friend of mine always says. Come to Flint, experience Flint, and say good things about Flint. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to learn more about this podcast, or if you have a story you'd like to share, go to nolithproductions.com.